Three creepy true horror stories that happened on Christmas, the worst weekend of my life. Meeting my ex-girlfriend's family during the holidays was supposed to be a joyous occasion. Kaylee and I had only been dating for a few months, but everything about her seemed perfect. Her kindness, intelligence, and effortless beauty made me feel like I'd hit the jackpot. When she invited me to spend Christmas with her family in Vermont, I thought it was a significant milestone in our relationship. Little did I know that weekend would haunt me forever. Her family lived in a remote part of Vermont, far removed from the bustling urban life we knew in Long Island. The 6-hour drive gave me time to prepare myself for first impressions. Kaylee assured me her family was small, just her parents and her older brother, Paul. "They're a little quirky," she said, laughing lightly, "but you'll love them." I smiled at her optimism, hoping I'd feel the same. As we approached the house late on Christmas Eve, my breath caught at the sight of their home. It was a massive, 2-story wooden lodge nestled among snow-covered pines. The sun was setting, and its light reflected off the tall windows, casting a warm, golden glow across the property. It felt magical, like something out of a winter postcard. For a brief moment, I convinced myself this would be a peaceful holiday retreat. Kaylee's parents greeted us as soon as we parked. Her father, Richard, was an imposing figure, tall, broad-shouldered, with steely gray hair and an unreadable expression. His handshake was firm, almost crushing, and he patted my back hard enough to push me forward a step. "Welcome," he said in a tone devoid of warmth. Her mother, Linda, was his opposite, short, bubbly, and brimming with an unsettling enthusiasm. She hugged me tightly, her wide, toothy smile lingering just a bit too long. Inside, the house was just as charming as the exterior. A roaring fire crackled in the stone fireplace, and the rustic wooden beams overhead gave the space a cozy yet grand atmosphere. Kaylee led me upstairs to the guest room, which had its own bathroom. "You okay?" she asked, noticing my silence. "Just tired from the drive," I replied, forcing a smile. I didn't want to come across as rude, but her parents' overly contrasting personalities left me uneasy. Downstairs, I met Kaylee's brother, Paul, who had just arrived. He was in his early 30s, tall and wiry, with a poorly maintained bowl haircut and a tattoo sleeve that seemed at odds with his otherwise drab demeanor. He offered a half-hearted "hey" before slumping onto the couch, barely glancing at me. I tried to start a conversation, but his answers were curt and disinterested, leaving me to awkwardly trail off. Dinner that evening was an ordeal. Richard's questions were pointed and relentless. "What do you do for a living? Where do you see yourself in 5 years? Are you planning to marry Kaylee?" The last question caught me so off guard that I stammered incoherently. Richard let out a low chuckle that sent a shiver through me. Linda, meanwhile, smiled incessantly, her expression so forced it felt more like a mask than a genuine show of joy. Paul remained silent throughout dinner, his gaze flitting between me and his plate. At one point, I glanced at him and caught him staring. He didn't look away, his eyes cold and calculating. I felt a bead of sweat trickle down my back and quickly averted my gaze. After dinner, we gathered in the living room to watch a Christmas movie. I couldn't focus on the screen. Paul's unwavering stare unnerved me. Even when I wasn't looking directly at him, I could feel his eyes on me. By the time the movie ended, I was more than ready to retreat to the guest room. As Kaylee got ready for bed in the bathroom, I noticed her phone on the nightstand. A notification appeared on the screen. Text from Mom. "Do you think he suspects anything yet?" My heart skipped a beat. I stared at the message, trying to make sense of it. Suspects anything? What did that mean? Was it about me? A sick joke? Before I could process the implications, the message disappeared, replaced by new message. My gut twisted. Should I say something to Kaylee? Should I act like I hadn't seen it? When she returned, I couldn't look at her the same way. "What's wrong?" she asked, concern etched on her face. "Just tired," I muttered. She shrugged, climbed into bed, and drifted off within minutes. I, however, lay awake, the text replaying in my mind. The next morning, I awoke to the smell of bacon and coffee. Downstairs, Linda greeted me with the same unnerving smile, handing me a steaming mug before insisting I try her famous pancakes. Kaylee and Richard were already seated, chatting about family traditions. Paul was absent, which was a relief. The festive atmosphere felt forced, like an elaborate stage play. As the day wore on, subtle oddities began to pile up. Linda would frequently glance at Richard, as if seeking silent approval for even the smallest actions. Paul eventually joined us, but said nothing the entire day, his presence a dark, brooding shadow. In the afternoon, Kaylee suggested a walk through the woods. I hesitated, but didn't want to seem rude. The snow crunched underfoot as we wandered deeper into the forest. The farther we went, the more isolated I felt. "This place is so peaceful," Kaylee said, smiling at me. I nodded, forcing a smile, but I couldn't shake the unease gnawing at my insides. At one point, I noticed her glancing at me when she thought I wasn't looking. Her expression wasn't one of love or affection. It was calculating, like she was sizing me up. That evening, the tension reached a boiling point. Over dinner, Richard asked if I enjoyed the walk. "It was nice," I replied cautiously. He smiled for the first time, but it wasn't comforting, it was menacing. "You know," he said, cutting into his steak, "this family values honesty. Secrets can be dangerous." Linda and Paul exchanged a glance, and I suddenly felt like prey surrounded by predators. My mind raced back to the text. What didn't they want me to suspect? After dinner, Kaylee pulled me aside. "Are you okay?" she asked, her voice soft but insistent. I wanted to tell her everything, the text, her family's strange behavior, but something in her eyes stopped me. They were cold, unfamiliar. "Yeah, just tired," I lied again. That night, I locked the guest room door and wedged a chair under the handle for good measure. Sleep eluded me, and every creak of the old house set my nerves on edge. At dawn, I packed my bags and prepared to leave. I'd tell Kaylee I wasn't feeling well and drive back to Long Island. As I reached the front door, Richard appeared out of nowhere. "Leaving already?" he asked, his voice eerily calm. "Yes, I think I'm coming down with something," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. He stepped closer, blocking the door. "You sure you're okay? You seemed off last night." Kaylee and Linda appeared behind him, their expressions unreadable. My pulse raced as I fumbled for an excuse. "I'll call you later," I said, pushing past them and bolting to my car. The drive home was a blur. My mind replayed every unsettling moment, every cryptic glance, every word left unsaid. I never contacted Kaylee again, and she didn't reach out either. To this day, I don't know what her family had planned for me, but I'm certain it wasn't good. The holidays have never been the same since. I couldn't sleep. My mind kept replaying that cryptic message I'd overheard earlier, trying desperately to make sense of it. Every word felt like a puzzle piece that refused to fit. a jagged fragment of something sinister lying just out of reach. The house was eerily silent, save for the occasional creak of the old wooden floors beneath the weight of time. Around 2 o'clock, I heard the faint rustle of sheets from across the room. Kaylee was stirring. I froze, closing my eyes tightly as she slid out of bed with a softness that spoke of practiced stealth. She tiptoed to my side, her footsteps muffled by the thick rug, and stood there for what felt like an eternity. My heart was pounding in my chest, so loud in my ears that I was convinced she could hear it. I forced myself to keep my breathing slow and steady, feigning sleep as my mind raced. Why is she standing there? What does she want? The air felt heavy with unspoken tension. Finally, after what must have been a full minute, she turned and walked away, the door clicking softly shut behind her. I let out a shaky breath and sat up, straining to listen. The house was still again, but not for long. Moments later, the sound of footsteps drifted up from the hallway more than one set. Someone had joined her. My stomach churned with unease. Who could it be at this hour? Sliding out of bed as quietly as I could, I crept to the door and cracked it open just enough to peer into the dimly lit hallway. Shadows danced along the walls as a faint light glowed from downstairs. I could hear whispers now, hushed and hurried, like a secret too dangerous to be spoken aloud. What's going on? Curiosity, coupled with a gnawing sense of dread, pushed me to investigate. I moved cautiously, placing my feet on the outer edges of the stairs to avoid the inevitable groan of the old wood. The voices were clearer now, emanating from the dining room. I stayed in the shadows, careful not to give myself away, and peeked around the corner. Kaylee was there, her silhouette framed by the dim light of a single lamp. Her parents, Linda and Richard, flanked her, their expressions grim and serious. Paul, Kaylee's older brother, leaned against the wall, his face shadowed but tense. They were huddled together, whispering urgently. When I go back up, Kaylee was saying, her voice barely audible, you stand by the door. What about the truck? Paul asked, glancing toward the front window as though expecting something or someone. Don't worry, Richard replied, his tone calm but cold. We'll handle it. My blood ran cold. Handle what? I backed away, my hands trembling. The sense of danger was palpable now, like a storm cloud hanging just above my head. I needed to leave. Whatever was going on here, I didn't want to stick around long enough to find out. I crept back upstairs, my heart hammering with every step. Once inside the guest room, I quietly closed the door and leaned against it, trying to steady my breath. My mind was a whirlwind of fear and confusion. I needed to get out of this house now. Grabbing my bag, I shoved my belongings inside with trembling hands. I reached for my car keys, but as I turned toward the door, something in the corner of the room caught my eye. Richard. He was sitting in a chair, barely visible in the shadows. My breath hitched as our eyes met. He was just staring at me, his expression blank, almost lifeless. What are you doing? I stammered, my voice barely above a whisper. He didn't respond. He didn't move. The stillness of his presence was suffocating, an invisible weight pressing down on my chest. I need to go, I managed to say, my voice quivering. Still, he said nothing. His silence was more terrifying than any words he could have spoken. Panic overtook me. I bolted for the door, yanking it open and rushing into the hallway. Behind me, I thought I heard the faint scrape of a chair against the floor, but I didn't dare look back. As I raced down the stairs, Linda's voice rang out, sharp and desperate. "Wait, don't go." Her plea sent a shiver down my spine, but I didn't stop. I threw open the front door and sprinted to my truck. My hands were shaking so violently that it took me 3 tries to get the key into the ignition. When the engine finally roared to life, I backed out of the driveway with reckless speed. Through the rearview mirror, I saw them all standing on the porch, illuminated by the dim glow of the porch light. Linda was smiling, but her eyes were wide and unblinking, almost manic. Kaylee stood beside her, her arms crossed tightly over her chest, her expression a mixture of anger and something else, something I couldn't quite place. Paul and Richard were motionless, their faces unreadable. The image burned itself into my mind as I sped away, the house growing smaller and smaller in the distance until it disappeared entirely. I didn't stop driving until I was miles away, pulling into a deserted gas station to catch my breath. My heart was still racing, my thoughts a chaotic mess of fear and confusion. Pulling out my phone, I saw a new text from Kaylee. What the expletive happened? I stared at the screen, my fingers hovering over the keyboard. What could I possibly say? Instead of replying, I locked my phone and sat there in silence, the events of the night replaying in my mind like a nightmare I couldn't wake up from. When I finally got home hours later, I typed out a message and hit send. I don't know what you and your family were planning, and I don't want to know. Don't ever contact me again. She never responded. For weeks, I couldn't shake the feeling of unease. Every creak of my floorboards, every shadow that shifted in the corner of my vision, sent a jolt of fear through me. I kept replaying that weekend in my head, dissecting every moment, every word, trying to piece together what had happened. What were they whispering about in the dining room? What was Richard doing in the guest room, sitting silently in the dark? What would they have done if I'd stayed? These questions haunted me, their answers locked away in the shadows of that house. I'll never know what Kaylee and her family were planning that night, and maybe that's for the best. But one thing is certain, I'll never spend another holiday with someone else's family again.